Okay, so in my first two videos, I put together more general tips of mistakes I see at low stakes live and ways that we can study better. So I thought a good way to follow it up would be some actual hand history so we can get into more in-game scenarios. So I have two hands here from a friend of mine he sent me from 25NL online. And I wanted to go over these sort of two ways. Number one, I wanted to go over them from what I think are the best decisions we can make in-game, or at least reasonable decisions. There's always different options you can take. And then I wanted to look at it from more of an optimal perspective of what we should be doing if we're playing against perfect opponents. Now, the reason I'm doing that is I don't think GTO strategies should ever be ignored. I think that people who are learning the game can benefit from knowing what the quote unquote correct answer is also. But I don't think they're necessarily the most important thing for people to get down first when they're learning poker. So I want to include in this video a bit for people who are a little bit newer to the game, and also people who may be more advanced or just want to see what the other side of things look like. So we'll get started here. And now neither of these hands are super complicated, so I thought it'd be good to start with a video of two of them. And this is sort of the reverse of my usual process when I'm not making a video. I tend to do the optimal strategy first and then see what adjustments we should be making from there. Now, I'm not saying these answers are perfect. I'm not saying the ranges are perfect, but I think we can just take a look and come to some conclusions. So let's get started. So the first hand here we have that I was sent was we have King Queen here in a 9 max online game, and we have a limper here. So we raised to 4x, and I like this. This is we want to raise a little bigger when there's a limper, and honestly, if you want to raise a little bit larger in these lower stakes, high rate games, I would have absolutely no problem with that anyway. Let's take a look at what our range may look like here. Sorry, I have both hands up. All right, here's our cutoff opening range, roughly. Now, this may not be precise, but it's going to be a reasonable approximation. Now, if you don't understand any of this, the yellow is just the hands that we open with, that we raise with, I guess technically because there was a limp, but whatever. I used an opening range. I sort of disregard the limp here, which we don't want to do fully, but it's fine for the sake of the video. And if you see sort of a blurrier box with a number in it, that just means we don't do it all the time. We do it about 50% of the time or 20% of the time, whatever. It was just that I wanted to include a couple of these outlier hands in the range so we can, so they're there when we look at it later. So that's about roughly our opening range. And we press play. And we get flatted from the dealer. Now our 4x open should minimize a little bit what they're flatting with, but I don't necessarily think it does in a low stakes game. People don't always understand that the larger raises should realistically constrict our range and have us playing less hands, or have someone playing less hands to that larger open. So I'm not going to make any wild assumptions about the button or that they're making large adjustments based on that sizing. Anyway, flop is 10 of spades, 9 of hearts, 7 of clubs. Now, let's look at the button's calling range here because that's important. And we're going to see, make sure I have the right one here. Here it is, button calling range. And we're going to see a couple things we can take away from this. So on this 10-9-7 flop here, and I'm sorry, my monitor's not that big, so you see me kind of clicking back and forth a little bit. On this 10-9-7 flop, we are going to be in a situation where these cards are going to hit both of our ranges. And what I mean by that is if we look at the middle of the graph here, on both of us, there's going to be a lot of filled-in space with these 10s, these 9s, and these 7s. So we can actually see a visual representation that this board is going to interact with both of us about equally. And I have a feeling when we take a look at the equity numbers in a few minutes, which I haven't actually gone over because I don't like to spoil my thought process by looking at the answers. It's sort of like having the answers in the back of the math book when you were a kid. And I think we're going to see that both of us have about 50% equity here. I'd be surprised if it was a whole lot different. So King, Queen, and they're going to have plenty of different hands here. Now, one other thing to note here is we have more of the stronger hands here. Now, we both have the Jack-8 suited at some frequency. He doesn't have it a lot. I'd expect that to sort of... I don't expect the button to flat that a lot there, but they can have it occasionally. You never quite know. But we have more of the 10s. We have the aces, the kings, the queens, probably the jacks. They don't really have a lot of those because they 3-bet them. So one thing to remember about ranges is they cannot have cards on the flop that they didn't have pre-flop. They can't magically change the cards in their hand. And that's really important. I see a lot of newer players not remembering to consider that they say, well, they could have this. It's like, well, they can't have that because they can't all of a sudden wake up with aces here if they don't really have aces pre-flop. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. So I'd expect this to be about half and half here on this flop of who's going to win this hand if it was to go to the, if it was just if we were to turn the turn in the river immediately, who would win this hand? It's going to be a 50-50, give or take a few percent. So let's see what happens here. We check, and the button bets $1.25. Now, we're going to need roughly 25% to call here, equity, with this particular hand, because when we do our pot odds calculation, we take the bet, we take the dot, and this calculation is actually in my other video if you just need it, but get it down. And we take the pot, which before the bet was 2.6 plus 1.25 plus 1.25. And we are going to find ourselves with 1.25 divided by 5.1. And that's a comma. 5.1, which means that we're going to need roughly, it's a shred under, but it's about 25% to call. Now, this particular hand here, even if button's a little bit tight, and even if, unless they're, absolutely absurdly tight, and we don't have any reason to believe that, even if they're a little bit tight, we're probably going to have in the 33 to 35% equity range if I had to take a shot in the dark, which means we should be calling, and I would guess at an optimal level, we would be raising some amount of the time here, but I will get into that more on the solver end of things. I don't think that we actually need to raise here against this population particularly often. So now I know what happens here, but we fold. And this is a mistake. And and I'm glad that he sent me this hand and we can go over it, because this is a mistake that looks small because they're small pots. You're folding the flop. You're not going to remember this hand later a lot of the time because it's not some memory implanting hand. It's not a huge all-in. It's something like that. But we are losing value when we do this. And when this happens over a long period of time, we're losing a lot of value. So let's take a look. Let's get the solver open on this hand, and let's take a look at some of our options. Now, my guess is that we're going to be calling mostly and raising a little bit, but nothing. Like, my guess is my raise would be like 15 to 25%, somewhere in there, with the king-queen off. But I don't mind shrinking that down because I doubt that this person is going to be having an optimal bluff range. So let's get that open here. Now, don't worry if you don't know what all these numbers are. I don't expect most people watching to, and it's absolutely fine. If you do, great. Here's what I'm using for simulations. These are simplified simulations. I run a little differently when I'm studying for myself, but I think they're absolutely fine for the channel. And I don't think we're giving up a lot of EV by only using single sizes here. So, all right. So let's take a look here. First thing we want to check is what our equities are on this flop, the 10 of spades, 9 of hearts, 7 of clubs. So our out of position equity, which is us, right around 49%, and in position is going to be obviously the rest of that for the about close to 51%, so pretty close to 50-50. And I actually think I put a few too many 8s in the buttons range, so I think it's basically 50-50. Anyway, so let's see what we're supposed to do here. Now, my guess would be we are betting a small amount of time. Well, it's not even guess. Right here, we're betting a small amount of time, 11% of the time versus 89% checks. I would have no problem with you checking your whole range here. This is going to be extremely difficult to near impossible to balance if you're not just, one of the best poker players in the world. And I don't think they're watching my videos. So this here is almost impossible. And when people when a solver suggests a strategy that is almost impossible to implement in game, what a lot of times you do is you round off that strategy and just sort of accept the minor loss of value that creates. So I would be totally fine with checking our whole range here, and we do check. And let's look at what their actions are. So they're going to be betting about half the time and checking about half the time, which makes sense. That being said, I don't expect this population to find as many bets with these lower pairs here, or even some of these ace-4 suiteds and things like that should be betting about a quarter of the time. and these are all the way up to, you should be betting these at an aggregate almost 50% of the time. And I don't expect it to be that often, which is why I think calling in position is better than raising, because raising folds out a lot of these. But if they don't have them, then we're not folding them out. So I think from an optimal standpoint, although my guess would be, so when they bet, my guess would be that we're raising king queen off a little under half. It looks about 40% of the time. Um, Even though we're doing that at an optimal level, there's I don't think we actually need to be doing it that often in game because they're not playing optimal poker. So I think calling is fine. Folding is a problem. We really want to find our folds from our aces in this situation, and the reason for that is the slight boost in showdown value for king queen versus ace x isn't going to be enough for the fact that, number one, we basically never make the nuts. We don't have the bonus of turning stronger hands a lot of the time. And a lot of these weaker aces were just absolutely dominated by parts of the range. So those are the folds we're going to find. These lower pairs are going to fold. But we really want to be calling with these hands that can make the nuts, that are strong. We find some calls from like from our sevens and things like that. And that's really what I want to be looking at. Even some of these sevens, if someone told me they folded like a king seven here, it wouldn't be correct, but I'd actually rather see some of those kind of things. I think because they can't make the nuts as often. That being said, I think folding those are a pretty large mistake. I'm just sort of musing about different spots here. But you'll even see we're folding hands as strong as ace king off, which means we really want to be calling with our king queens and these hands that can turn big hands, especially in a 100 big blind deep pot. So that's that hand. I hope that was clear. And if there are any questions about the hand, please put them in the comments. Feel free to reach out to me, and I'd be happy to go over it. The general conclusion here, though, is these kind of hands that look small, we want to make sure that we are not overfolding in them and things along those lines. So yeah, that's that hand there. And let's move on to the next hand. All right, so we have pocket fours. And we open at 75 cents, perfectly normal, 3x open. We get flatted by the small blind. Small blind's flatting range should be I know people that don't even have a flatting range here, and I'm completely okay with that. The reasons being that the small blind is the hardest position to play in poker, and 3-bet or fold is going to take a lot of the difficulty out of that. So they flat, and that's fine. A lot of time, and it's hard to assign an exact range to the small blind here because I don't know what kind of flatting range he's playing, but it's going to be a lot of this middle strength hands here, some suited hands, things along those lines. So I gave what I kind of took a shot in the dark at here, but it's going to be a lot of this kind of stuff here. Personally, I think in these games, at these stakes with this rake, I'd prefer a 3-bet or fold strategy because I just don't see a lot of people achieving a lot of balance with this. And playing these medium strength hands out of position is not going to be profitable a lot of the time. But anyway, this is about where I have us here. Fours opening, and roughly they're flats here. And this may be a bit off, but it's going to be close enough to get some information. So we bet $1 and a flop. Perfectly okay with this. I'm glad that we found a bet with this part of our range here. I think our solver will agree. Having the 4 clubs takes some of their bluffs away and some of their bluff raises away. We also block some of like their ace-4 club type hands, things like that if they do have them. Even some 5-6 of clubs if they ever have them, things like that. I'm sorry, 4-5 of clubs, not 5-6 of clubs. Things along those lines. So perfectly good with a bet here. They call, turns a 3 of spades. Pretty dead card. This isn't really going to affect anybody's range too heavily. They have pocket threes, we have pocket threes, but whatever. It's really not going to change much at all. So $3.75 in the pot. And let's play. They check. We check. River's a 6 of hearts. And at this point, I'm going to be folding to anything but real small sizes. We need to bluff catch here a little bit because of the club bricks and the straight bricks and things like that. But I think a lot of those find a raise at some point. And I also don't expect a lot of like the ace X of clubs to actually bet the river. I think they're just going to check and take their showdown value, which they have a reasonable amount of. But anyway, player 2 bets 275. So let's take a look at our odds here. We have, clear out our little problem here. 2.75 into what we're at, 3.75 plus 2.75 plus 2.75. Some people do pot odds better by just grabbing a fraction. This has always been easier for me. I don't care which way you do it, as long as you do the math. So plus 5.5 is 8.75. So 9.25, 2.75 divided by 9.25. And, we're looking at roughly a third there. A little bit under. So, again, pretty close to like 27%, something like that. So, when we look here, we're going to want to be calling with hands that we do need to make some calls here with hands that are technically bluff catchers. Fours is probably too weak most of the time because I don't expect quite as many bluffs as they should have. That's generally the norm at these stakes. And I think we can defend a lot better with random 10x's. Even something like a 6 suited is going to defend well. That gets there. Nobody should have a queen here particularly often. But they still have some hands. They have a bunch of 10s. They even have hands like 7s and 8s that may go for value here on this river, which would not be unheard of. Things along those lines. So I think folding here is absolutely fine. I don't think we're going to come out ahead calling here with this particular combo. And we do fold. All right. Now let's open this up here. We look at the ranges here. Let's go to I'm more interested in our flop and turn play anyway. I think river's going to be a fold basically all the time. So let's take a look here. First of all, let's look at our equities on this flop. The equity out of position, which is going to be the small blind, is going to be reasonably low. They're at 41% here on this queen 10 flop, which puts us the other 58%. So I like betting with the range advantage. And I like betting with this particular combo because it is ahead a reasonable amount of time. It needs a lot of protection. We block some of their check raise range with the club. So it seems like a perfectly reasonable combo for me to bet here. Let's see what it says here. So they check out of position. Yeah, and fours is going to be betting here almost all of the time. And again, we're going to functionally round up here to betting these fours all of the time. So we bet. They call. And the turn is a 3 of spades. And they're going to be checking again their whole range here. Pretty simple. Now, looking here, we can find some bets with fours here. But our bets, which makes sense, our bets are more likely to come from the fours without the club. With the club, we're starting to block some relevant hands. Whereas without the club, they're more likely to peel with hands that we're ahead of, or even fold some hands that we need a lot of protection from. So with this particular hand, I'm perfectly fine with checking. Again, betting can't be that bad, but either way. So we check, or maybe I did solve it over here. Let's take a look. 6 of hearts. Yeah, so they bet roughly 3. Yeah, and we find folds with this combo of fours pretty often here, which is expected. We're blocking a lot of the bluffs that they end up betting the river with having that 4. Like, I do think 4-5 is going to bet that. No, probably not actually. So we're blocking a lot of these turns. We're blocking a lot of the range that they actually do bluff, which makes our bluff catcher obviously worse because if they don't have those cards that they're bluffing with, they have way more of these hands that hit this board in some capacity or another, hands like pocket 9s, pocket 8s, things of that nature. And those may bet for value here. So I think folding is absolutely fine. And you'll see some weird stuff out of Pio. Like Pio wants to raise 2s here because we block nothing relevant and they have to fold out some hands that we lose to, but whatever. Here you're looking at that. I think these pocket fours here are perfectly reasonable to fold. Here's our overall construction for anyone who's curious. And they actually have a bit of a leading range here. Once we get to the river also. But anyway, I don't get too deep into that rabbit hole. So, in all, I think the first hand we could definitely be calling that flop. The second hand, I think we played pretty well. There's obviously options to do other things as we looked at here, but I think we've made some good decisions there, and the fold seems fine. So I hope these were helpful. I hope this gave a little bit of information. If there's ways you'd like me to present something differently, put it in the comments. If I'm going over something too quickly or assuming that people know too much, please let me know. If I'm just not being clear, please let me know. So, yep, if you liked the video, like, subscribe, and I'll be doing a bit more of these. Thank you, and you have a good afternoon.